This podcast is supported by Manitou Fund. We want to thank them for coming on board and helping to support this podcast. Really means a lot to us. Hey everyone, Zach here. We just wanted to say that we hope you're all staying safe and healthy with so much going on right now in the world. Remember to be good to each other, and thank you for listening. Welcome back to the Fieldwork Podcast. I'm Zach Johnson.
My name is Mitchell Hora, the most official, non-official, sustainable ag podcast ever.
In the world.
In the whole world. The podcast where we talk about the challenges facing farmers in sustainable agriculture. We're not going to sugarcoat it. We're going to tell you what's up. Today we're going to look specifically at different ways that farmers can create income outside of row crops or livestock, aka alternative sources of revenue.
So how about wind turbines or solar panels? Are those something that can actually provide consistent additional cash? We'll first hear from Patrick Duncanson, who is a Minnesota corn and soybean farmer. He installed some solar panels on his farm about 5 years ago. We'll also talk to Fritz Ebinger. He works on energy efficiency and renewable energy initiatives at the Clean Energy Resource Teams. That's part of the University of Minnesota's Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships and Extension.
Part of his role is to assess which farms are able to put up solar panels and what are some of the other challenges that folks interested in renewable energy might face as adopting these systems.
Yeah, a lot to talk about here, so let's get right to it and quit babbling. So Patrick Duncanson, you're a farmer from South Central Minnesota, and our topic here today, we're talking about alternative sources of revenue and kind of being creative on your farm and thinking about the other ways other than maybe just crop or livestock farming to make some income. You've got kind of an interesting story when it comes to some of that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your farm and then kind of lead us into what you've done with solar?
Sure. So in Blue Earth County, South Central Minnesota, we have a fairly traditional farm relating to growing corn and soybeans. We are not very close to an urban market, meaning we're about 100 miles from Minneapolis, and so truck farming or vegetable farming isn't real common in our area at all. It's
difficult to find a niche market if you don't have a population to pull from.
Exactly. We are very fortunate from a soybean standpoint is that we sit between Mankato and Fairmont, two large processing cities, two large processing plants for soybean meal. That's a really good thing in that we have usually a fairly good soybean basis, but it also means that our alternatives to compete with that basis from a specialized soybean market are somewhat limited.
Sure.
In that we're pretty competitive in the commodity business because our basis is strong because of those processing plants.
Yep.
We're also in about a corn neutral county, meaning Blue Earth County has enough corn demand from surrounding ethanol plants, even though there aren't necessarily too many big plants in Blue Earth County, but strong feed demand. From a strong livestock tradition and a very robust livestock tradition, primarily today in feeding hogs and producing pork.
Sure.
We're a very strong commodity county. Specialties are usually limited to soybean seed production, although this year we are also growing some non-GMO direct export soybeans for a local seed farm that is very involved in that.
Tell us about how you got into solar.
So we'd been looking for ways to keep expanding our farm, to keep investing in our farm. We had been exposed to solar energy and on-farm solar energy at some of our peer group and farm group meetings that we go to, and a friend that I'd known for 15 or so years, and his son started a solar sales company, and they presented at one of the farm meetings, and we followed up at the meetings with a phone call and said, well, we would be interested in talking. And it took about 2 years probably after we started those conversations before we actually built and did something.
Was that, so the 2 years that were in there, was that because you just weren't in a hurry? You weren't super interested, or was it because the process took that long?
All of the above.
All of the above. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the time frame on this for reference?
So we've been producing now for a couple of years.
Okay.
Maybe 3 years.
3 years. So 5 years ago was like kind of in the conversations. What was it looking like there? Or like what was that thought process that got you to be like, okay, this seems like something that would be good for us?
Well, first of all, it was about the time that we were making a transition in our farm, and we were looking for ways to expand our farm outside of the traditional corn and soybean commodity, which seems a little bit like a treadmill. Either you need to be really, really high volume and make incredibly small margins, or you have to figure out how can I get a little bit bigger margin on my smaller volumes to generate the income that we need to support our families. And that's a challenge that all of us as farmers have. Is do I want to be a multi-thousand acre farmer? And it seems like it's never enough. It's a treadmill that once you get on, the next size bigger John Deere combine or Case combine would be nicer to have and would fit in all those pieces.
Right. You can pick up acres, then you need more machinery to keep up with that,
People.
right?
Which you need more acres.
You need more acres, you need more people, you need... yes, exactly.
And then we hit a year like 2019 where cropping plans and budgets and efficiencies in the field go out the window, and we literally had 30 or 40 hours to plant a corn crop.
Yeah.
Not a week or two.
Mother Nature just throws a wrench in everything you try and do, everything you think you have figured out.
Yeah.
It works out good on paper in the winter.
So we were looking for alternatives and saying, well, what can we do? And so we're involved in a couple different aspects. We have some on-farm solar, and we also have a relationship in a community solar garden, which are somewhat unique for Minnesota.
So explain those a little bit more.
So the on-farm is pretty traditional in that we signed loan documents, but it was 100% financed with the help of the partnership with them. So we didn't have to put up any collateral or anything, but we did have to personally sign and agree that we would pay these loan documents off. And those are traditional units. One of them is mounted on the roof of our big pole shed that we have in our yard by our dryer setup. And that's a 20 kilowatt unit. That meter is on an XL Energy program. XL Energy also has, for certain sized units, 20 to 40 kilowatts. Those are relatively small, and they're subsidized quite heavily by XL and by the state in order to meet some of their renewable standards.
So that 20 kilowatts is enough for like your farm and a little bit more that's going off?
20 is a kind of a nice one for I'm going to say a small farmyard. But with Minnesota's net metering, it isn't exactly tied to how much you use in your yard. If you use more than you generate, you just buy it. If you use less than you generate, you get a credit for it. Yeah. And at the end of the year, we settle up, and we use way more energy than we generate from that 20. So we also have one. We also have a 55 or 60 kilowatt, I believe it is, at one of our hog finishing sites where we have 4,000 finishing pigs, and that's not quite enough, but it's fairly well matched to generate about enough energy for that hog site. It's a curtain-sided site. It's not power ventilated. Seasonally, we generate a lot of electricity in the summer from the solar, but in the winter we use a fair amount of electricity at those hog barns. So seasonally, it's not really all that well balanced, but it's fairly nice from a dollar standpoint.
Maybe it balances out at the end of the day.
Yeah, because those credits end up coming back to you, right?
Yep.
Are those able to fit just on the roof, or those are like kind of standalone?
So we chose not to put them on the roof just because of the question of, we've got the question of, with the finishing barn, how long are the roofs going to last? We had a small sliver of land that was part of the setbacks that we had to have from a property line standpoint and setbacks from wells. And so we had some dead space on the farm that we were able to use. I love that site especially, even though it's on an REA and the return to the solar isn't quite as good, but it helps complete, I'm going to say, the full circle of what livestock feeding does for us. So livestock feeding uses the corn and soybeans that we grow. We produce quality pork. We get the manure back that we put on the farmland, and now we've got solar energy as part of the full circle.
Yeah, that's very cool. Explain the solar garden now too.
Sure. So I'm gonna finish up a little bit with the simpler units, the ones on our farm. The one that's on XL has approximately we expect about a 7-year payback. That after 7 years in using the investment tax credit ourselves and paying for the solar, and the developer that we worked with, we don't have to worry necessarily how much it produces because our loan payments are directly tied to how much the unit produces. So if the unit if our production estimates were off by 50%, our loan is just extended for a longer
But the
period
loan
of
is
time.
through the company.
The
not
loan
through
is,
the bank.
is there is a bank tied to it.
Right.
So there had to be a bank that was willing to be a little flexible with the developer. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you've got multiple contracts. They're not all with Excel, right?
No, so we have one with Excel, and then we one where we sell where our meter is with Excel. Yeah, and the other one is with an REA, with a rural electric co-op, with it's Benco.
And the
based in
separate
Vancouver.
contracts are with separate panels.
Yes,
separate sites.
Separate sites.
Sure.
Yep, 2 separate sites.
So how do you calculate a rate of return on this? The return on investment over time. How do you what's the process like looking at that when you're trying to decide if this is something you should go ahead with or not?
Yeah, so you start building a spreadsheet. And
Yep.
the developer that we worked with had those all built for us. Surprise, surprise.
Oh,
He
there
made
you
it
go.
pretty easy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
But very similar. I'm going to say the process that we went through was very similar to how we looked at building hog finishing barns, in that we looked at, well, what's the expected rent going to be? So in this case, what's the production of the electricity going to be, and what's that worth? So we have to make, in the short term, the next couple of years, that's fairly easy to make estimates. What are our electric rates going to be? We made the assumption that electric rates are probably not going to go down.
Probably a fair assumption.
Yeah. But every once in a while, you run into someone who will say, well, do you remember that time in the early 19 whatevers where we went through 3 years where electric rates actually went down? And there is a period of time in Minnesota where that did happen.
Sure.
And it was like, no, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
So you have to make assumptions, and you have to trust in a system, and you have to trust in a relationship. So we first of all had the trust in the developer, and trust is verified. I mean, you don't blindly just follow somebody, but you listen to what they say and you check it out, and if it checks out, you start to build some relationship with
Sure.
it. So we started to build spreadsheets, and we started to put together assumptions and cost factors. At the end of the day, it looked like the program on Excel would pay back in about 7 years. The program on the rural electric co-op that we built at the other site would pay back in about 12 or 13 years. Those numbers were very similar to what we looked at when we were building hog finishing barns. So I looked at it kind of the same way, and I had the same trust, and that has worked out very well for us, in that we actually went through those periods of times where we borrowed a lot of money.
Yep.
And built those finishing barns, and we worked at very low wages in those barns for several years, and put the money back into the barns, and lo and behold, the barns are paid for, and those barns put my kids through college.
Sure.
And I think that one of the best financial investments I ever did farming-wise, besides tiling, was probably the investment in those finishing barns, because it provided a return separate from corn and soybean production that complemented corn and soybean production, and it really made our farm financially stable.
I think a lot of times that's the key, is when you're a farmer or any business owner, probably, if you're going to branch out and try to invest into something else, make it something that's complementary to what you're doing and increase the strength of what you're already focusing
and
on.
doesn't distract it. And the
Right.
timing was right. When we did that, when we made those decisions 15 years ago or so, the timing was right. And I don't know that the timing necessarily is as good today as it was then. I suspect that it's not. And the same thing with solar. When we did this a few years ago, the timing was right for us to do that.
Sure.
So the timing not only has to be right for you, it also has to be right for the marketplace.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So those two units will pay for themselves based on the amount of energy that they produce, assuming that we can use the investment tax credit, which we can, and they'll pay for themselves after a few years. The solar garden concept is totally different from that, and we need to I'm going to say start over in the thought process and the discussion. The solar garden, because we owned a piece of ground that was next to an electric transmission substation. It was about a mile away, so it wasn't necessarily next to it. It was also next to the city of the small town city of Mapleton, and it was rather difficult for us to farm, in that it wasn't an ideal piece of farmland for producing corn and soybeans. So we were in that. Even though it was a small town, I'm going to say that urban farm interface of every time we go up there at midnight to do tillage or something, we've got lights shining in people's houses. Every time we spray pesticides, we have to be very, very sensitive of small gardens and flowers. And it seemed like we would spray fungicides late summer, and someone would say, gee, your pesticide made my flowers wilt.
Right.
Of course. Yeah.
Which chemistry-wise, farmers know that fungicides don't make
Yeah.
flowers wilt.
Right.
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 And not only that, the wind was blowing in the other direction anyway.
Right.
So we had this piece of ground that was very odd shaped. It had about 15 corners in it. And we couldn't use manure on it. We couldn't do a lot of things that we feel we need to do to sustainably produce a crop. And it also fit well with the concept of we can get rid of the power because there's a power line right next to it that we can hook onto. So it had a pretty good development, a pretty low development cost for the solar developers. So several years ago, Xcel Energy was encouraged to develop these relatively small-scale solar gardens. The concept is, rather than everyone in town or everyone in the community putting solar on their roof or on their garage or in their backyard, it's a lot more efficient to bundle them together in a unit that doesn't have shade trees and is in a quantity that can be built and managed more efficiently. So that's the concept of solar garden. And then subscribers, citizens, customers of the utility, and in this case, you have to be an Xcel customer to subscribe to the solar garden that we're involved with. And I'm not aware of any other utilities in Minnesota that are doing solar gardens, but perhaps there are. So if you're a customer of that utility, then you can sign up to be in a solar garden. You don't have to do any financial commitment other than agree to buy the energy for a long period of time. So it's a 20-year commitment, and if you don't sign any financial commitments other than agree to buy the energy. And if you do that, you'll get what amounts to about a 10% reduction in your electric bill. So if you're normally paying $100 a month for your house, you now would pay a net of about $90. Yep. So that's the solar garden concept. So with
how big is this solar garden? Because I've heard of like a solar farm.
Yep.
Right.
What's the difference there?
So this is a solar farm that is used specifically for a solar garden. So this is it covers about 30 acres of what used to be our cropland.
Sure. Was this land that you owned?
Yeah, this was family-owned land. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And so we became landlords in a long-term lease with a developer for this solar project. And so we are landlords in a solar garden.
And so you still own the property.
We still own the property.
If the solar panels go away at some point, that is still your land.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. And if the solar panels don't go away at some point, it's still our land regardless, right?
Yep.
Right.
And in 25 or 30 years, when the solar lease that we have with the developer is over, they are required to return it to farmland condition. So it's up to them to go out and
remove all the stuff. That was going to be my question.
remove all the wire, remove all the posts.
Yeah.
However, I'm also expecting that unless there's a new energy source developed, we will probably continue to be capturing solar energy.
Yep.
And this piece of farmland will probably never go back to crop production. It will probably be in energy production for the foreseeable future.
It would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially and I'm old enough to not have to worry about renewing that contract.
So it'll become somebody else's issue.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of it, and it's fun to hear about it and everything, but what are the negatives to doing this? Because obviously you drive around the countryside, and not every farmer's got a solar panel on their site, right? So what are the difficulties and the negatives to this thought process when you're thinking about it, if somebody's out there is considering it?
So we had some headwinds, even though the utilities on their websites and in their public forums will say, oh, yes, we support renewable energy and we want to move in this direction. At the end of the day, they're not making any money on any of the renewable energy that we produce. In fact, there's a responsibility because of net metering laws that we still have access to power when we need additional power, and they have to buy any surplus. So it's a little bit of an adversarial relationship with the utilities in general.
Sure.
So if it wasn't for strong public sentiment, they wouldn't probably be as supportive even as they are of renewable energy today. And part of that is dictated by law, is that they have to be supportive of small-scale renewable energy.
Similar to other industries and other renewable energy sources, right?
Yes. Yeah. If it wasn't for some, I'm going to say, market distorting regulations and laws,
Yep.
renewable energy probably wouldn't be where it is today.
It'd be really difficult, wouldn't
Yeah,
it?
it would.
It just doesn't fully pencil out
doesn't
compared to
fully
some of the
pencil
traditional
out.
ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing that made a difference for us is that particularly with solar, in order to fully take advantage of it, you have to be able to use investment tax credit. And
Sure.
we were in a situation in our career and in our farm that we were starting to pay some income taxes. And so we were able to take advantage of some of those investment tax credits that are part of the solar package. And so we were
Okay.
able to use those ourselves rather than having to sell them off and have somebody else use them and get compensated for those credits.
Sure.
Solar and solar farms don't go without controversy, especially in rural areas. And as I drive up and down the road and I see a lot of these being developed in the last few years, and it's not just because we got ours done, now nobody else should do it. No, I don't feel that way at all. There's plenty of room. There's plenty of energy demand. There's plenty of sunshine. None of this takes away from anything we've done. But I do question whether we should be doing this on prime farmland.
Right.
And there is a great argument about, well, what's the best land use? And I'm an economist by training. I'm a graduate of the University of Minnesota, CFAN's ag business degree. And I tend to look at things, well, how do we get the best efficiency and how do we get the best use out of it? And how do we also balance the ecology that's involved with it? So if we can somehow figure out, well, maybe here's a piece of land, farmland that isn't grade A prime farmland, is there a better use for it? Maybe we can produce solar on some of that, rather than converting grade A farmland, that's the prime stuff for corn and soybeans.
Right.
And also, if we've got solar on it, maybe we can also do some other things that are good for society, like pollinator habitat, or
Sure.
maybe we can graze livestock underneath it, or maybe we can use it for a wetland bank or a wetland reserve, and just raise the solar panels up a little higher so they're safe and secure from water, and we can multi-purpose and multi-use some of these lands.
Yeah.
It's particularly exciting when you go to other parts of the country and they're using solar as parking lot covers.
Right.
Particularly in the Southwest, where parking lot covers from protection from sun is really important.
What's the feedback been like when you're jumping back to the solar garden here on this 30 acres that's right next to a town, where the guy was, maybe had mentioned that your fungicide had made the flowers wilt? Is that guy complaining about solar panels being in his backyard now?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, because now he wants to look out at, well, I always wanted to look out at corn and soybeans. That's why I, bought this house. That's why I bought this lot.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. And so there's a little bit of that. There's also the neighbor that's he thinks it's a driving range.
Oh, yeah.
Ah.
So he's teeing up and hitting golf balls out into the
The solar garden.
into
there.
the solar garden, yeah,
Is
and
that
causing
because
damage to
He
the...
loves golfing?
No.
Okay.
Ah.
But the developer that we worked with worked pretty hard. So these solar gardens have to be fenced.
Okay.
And so it's a fairly benign chain link fence, but not all that attractive. But they worked pretty hard in doing landscaping and planting some greenery type things in front of it, so that in a few years the fence is not going to be really all that visible.
Oh, cool.
So it's going to look like in your backyard. It's going to look like a neighbor's, backyard. You're going to have greenery around it. So
Sure.
they worked pretty good. They were very good. The developer that we worked with, even though the original developers sold the project, there was enough goodwill and it was the right kind of companies that they still cared about what it looked like in the community.
Well, they have to, right? I mean, they have to protect their reputation and your reputation,
And thankfully they did.
Yeah.
So we took a little bit of we were lucky in that regard. We didn't foresee that happening, and we were lucky that it happened as well as it did.
Sure.
But there's some real home runs. So not only, financially this is a little bit of diversity, but at the end of the day, our family can probably buy groceries anyway.
Sure.
And we'll do okay.
Yep.
But it's sure nice, for my nieces and nephews, especially the ones who aren't living on the farm, to know that we're involved and that we care about some things like this, and that we're willing to look at alternative energy sources as a sound investment.
Yep.
So that's a good thing. It's really good for our small town. This was one of the largest construction projects Mapleton ever saw.
Oh, wow.
And it was, several $1 million one-time investment.
Right.
In the community. So for the few months that it was being built, and it was built through the middle of a cold winter, although it seems like it we've had several cold winters, but
Right.
a couple of years ago we had they built pretty much through December, January, and February in a really brutal stretch of cold weather, and they worked almost every day. Several local people did get jobs with the contractors, and then there were many people from out of town who worked there as well. So there was the immediate construction boost, but then there's also the boost to the local tax base.
Yeah.
And that's good for the small town as well.
Across your farm, you are doing quite a bit of different sustainability, conservation type of stuff, but it seems like the solar aspect is a little bit more about revenue and diversifying revenue, even more than the conservation side of things. But how do you think about that balance?
Well, first of all, in our farm, we try to follow a triple bottom line approach, and we don't just say that flippantly and loosely. We really do. We are committed to that. So I tend to look at farm profitability as the first piece. That if there isn't a way for the farm to financially sustain it, it doesn't matter.
It's exactly what we've talked about it.
It doesn't
a lot.
work.
We talk about that all the time on this podcast.
Yeah, so we looked at the solar piece probably financially first, and then it was like, okay, financially this seems to make sense. Now, are there other reasons why we want to do it? It was really fun to be involved in the permitting process with the city of Mapleton and the solar garden when the city of Mapleton got behind it and said, wow, this is really good for our town.
Right.
This is really good for the subscribers of XL Energy that can become members of the solar garden.
Yeah.
It's also good for our tax base, which helps Main Street. And it was so fun to be involved in a project from that side of the equation rather than the adversarial side about, well, this is good for our farm and financially we're going to benefit, but it's pretty hard.
Not that good for everybody else.
Not that good for everybody else. And trust me, we've been involved in a lot of those arguments.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it be drainage or livestock production or any of the things that we do in farms.
Sure. What's your advice to other farmers that are hearing this and considering solar?
Talk to more than one developer. Yeah, don't just listen to one guy and believe everything he says. I mean, verify it from somebody else. So talk to a couple different developers, and it's pretty easy to open a farm magazine today and find out places where you can go to and someone will sell you solar equipment. We were lucky in Minnesota in that we were protected and encouraged by state law, and the net metering law that we have in Minnesota is really important for making all of this very easy. I have a friend who's went through and built some solar production capabilities on their farm in Illinois, and their equations and their questions were a lot different than what we had to go through, in part because of the net metering law that we have in Minnesota. Yeah,
really cool stuff. We appreciate you coming in. This has been really, really interesting and a different kind of topic, but still a very important part of sustainable agriculture and thinking about a very holistic approach. So thanks for coming in and joining us here on the podcast today.
Sure. It's been fun.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Really appreciate it.
That was Patrick Duncanson, a corn and soybean farmer from South Central Minnesota.
The script
Actually
says
Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Minnesota. I like that.
After the break, we'll hear from Fritz Ebinger from the Clean Energy Resource Teams. Welcome back. You're listening to the Fieldwork Podcast. Now to our conversation with Fritz Ebinger.
Yeah, I'm the program manager for rural energy development at the Clean Energy Resource Teams. Yeah.
Okay, There you go. You said it better than I did.
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah.
That's all right. Yeah.
Can you explain to us a little bit about what that program involves, what it is they do, and what you oversee and what the goals are?
Sure. Our job is to connect communities and people to the resources they need to implement clean energy projects. And we work with pretty much all comers. Our agenda is primarily to work with people where they are. So whether you are, I guess for this crowd, if you are a livestock farmer, you're trying to figure out how to better ventilate your barns more efficiently, we can coach you towards resources on that end. If you want to put up solar, I come out to the farm and I'll do a site assessment and kind of quantify your kilowatt hours and your energy use patterns and figure out whether solar is the right choice or whether you want to focus on efficiency first. We don't do any advocacy, just to be clear about that. We don't show up at the legislature with any politics or anything like that. What we do is try and give people information. So sometimes it's not good information. Sometimes we'll say, yeah, like as much as you want to host solar energy in your community, you just have a horrible spot for it. There's no bandwidth. Sure. It's just not in the cards.
We were just talking with, Patrick that has a solar garden on one of his farms. And yeah, they had originally put it up and the neighbors were like, well, I don't want to see that either. But he said that they're building or that they've planted trees and trying to make it look a little bit better. But so
right.
We don't want to
nobody wants to stand on the back patio and
look at that.
and stare at solar panels 30 feet away, right?
Squirrels and your chickens.
Yeah, you want squirrels and chickens, and I like cornfields personally.
Most jurisdictions in Minnesota require low-growth pollinator species
around the solar farms,
underneath them.
Yeah,
call those dandelions.
So that's been I think that's an aesthetic improvement. I think a lot of renewable energy is based on perception. How do you change people's minds about what it is? Because if you have, essentially you're taking a small amount of row crop agriculture out of production, putting panels on top of it, so you're returning, and then putting low growth prairie underneath it, then you're basically recreating what was there before. We had eons of prairie before we decided to come till it up. But what it does is it creates habitat for ground nesting birds, and I'm fairly certain there are a fair number of farmers that like to hunt, and then little critters like that. And you just got to make sure people have a say in how it goes in. And I think once you help them understand, it does have improvements on things like water quality, and you have deep root prairie that helps with stormwater infiltration.
So one of the issues is that you might be too far from a transmission station. Is that how common is that? How do you navigate some of those type of concerns?
All right, well, I'm going to split this conversation a little bit. So everything I was talking about before had to do with basically on-farm installation to serve the farm itself. Weekly, I get about 2 or 3 phone calls from farmers who want to host utility scale generation. And in my mind, that's about a 1 megawatt community solar garden. Xcel Energy has a community solar garden program where a developer will go out and develop a site, get a bunch of subscribers to the output from those panels. Xcel Energy is required to buy the output from that solar garden and then do the offset math on the bill of whoever the subscribers are. If that makes sense. It's like a triangular relationship. So a lot of farmers have learned that that's a pretty good form of passive income. Usually the lease rates are from around $800 to $1,200. The stuff that's crossed our desk is usually around $1,000 per acre per year just to host solar.
That'd be pretty all right, Zach.
Yeah. And the reason, you're kind of getting into the punchline is that, it takes up about 7 to 10 acres. So it's, if you're lucky enough to host a community solar garden, it's basically $10,000 a year in passive income. You don't have any inputs. You don't have to till it. But you might make an enemy out of a neighbor. So that's hopefully not. Generally, it's done the right way. There's plenty of resources
what
out
we've
there.
been talking about here is if you place it in the correct area, use some ground that's maybe not great for trying to farm corn and soybeans anyway.
Right.
Maybe you put it there.
Which generally near a town, near a city, a lot of times there are acres like that, right? Because there's buildings around and.
Yeah. So the developers are subject to those market forces too. So they're seeking less productive land. They're looking at crop productivity indices. I know for a fact a criteria they look at is what's the likelihood that the neighborhood is not going to be happy about this, because they know that it requires more administration on their part, more public hearings. I think the worst case scenario for a lot of developers is to go to a county that has nothing on the books about solar because it's a black hole and they don't know what's going to happen. They may have a perfect site. There might be, for a utility scale development, they might have great transmission capacity, which is another requirement. But then the county comes to the county and they're like, well, we don't know. So we're just going to deny it until we can figure this out, or they'll set out a moratorium.
Right.
So
just sort of push it away because they don't understand it.
It's easier to say. It's easier to say no.
Yeah.
And that's an understandable thing.
Totally.
If you don't understand something, how heavy do you try to invest in something?
Yeah,
right?
and I should clarify. every community is entitled to shape their community as they want it to be. I think that's an important component. And generally, like, once we can have that conversation with folks and, have citizens voice their opinions about how something should be, kind of set up the rules of the road, things go a lot more smoother. I think the worst scenarios are when people feel like, they didn't really get their fair shake at how this should look or how it should go.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Did we?
Yeah, so there's the grants. So
Yeah.
so that's part of like this. So they come to you, okay, so livestock farmer
Yep.
or grain farmer, that somebody who's spending a lot of money on
Right.
electricity, really. Somebody who's got a high electrical bill,
Yep.
comes to you, try to figure out, okay, what's the right thing for me? Should I put up solar? Should I maybe do wind? Should I
Energy
but
efficiency.
First is energy efficiency.
Yeah.
Turn off your lights when you leave the house and that kind of stuff. And better
Can you
light
teach
bulbs.
that to my family?
Yeah, yeah.
Just turn the lights off?
Yeah, just turn the lights
And then
off
we
when
don't
you're
have
done.
to put up a windmill.
Occupancy sensors. Occupancy sensors. There you go.
There you go. Until you have your dog running around and turn
Well,
it on all the time.
You could.
Or your chickens that are in
Do
the
you
house.
train the dogs to run around and just kill the light switches?
There you go. That's what we need.
There you go.
That's what
we should
need.
work on that.
Chickens that kill the lights.
So you're figuring out, okay, here's the right kind of program that we want. Here's a grant that we can apply from
Yeah.
through the federal government.
Part of the difficulty right now is that the farm economy is so down, people don't have the income or even the tax liability, or oftentimes they're still depreciating something. So, but generally, dairy farmers are people that wield a lot of capital in just their operation are probably good candidates. I take all comers, so I'll work with like a small vegetable farmer who has a CSA, but oftentimes money can be a barrier.
And you might be able to make a little bit of money by selling your extra back to the grid.
Yeah, and that, just to clarify, that shouldn't be the goal. I mean,
That's not the goal. Yeah,
You
yeah.
don't want to sell. I mean,
How does wind fit into this? I assume there's got to be times when wind is more efficient, and then what's the installation and the maintenance like on wind energy versus solar?
so
Pinwheels.
for those utility scale developments, those are the 100, 200, 300 megawatt installations. Generally, the farmer's role in that is primarily landlord, and it's a good deal. Just as rough numbers, they pay probably around $5,000 a megawatt, and one turbine is going to be at least 2 megawatts now. So you're looking at about $10,000 a year to host a wind turbine on your land. And then developers are smart. Well, they will go after larger landowners to try and put as many turbines on that land as they can. So
Under one contract, sure.
yeah, that is. You really got to be careful there. I would, if a farmer is approached by a developer, I would definitely suggest the farmer talk to an attorney. Have the attorney. It's like a 50-page contract, and it's like for 40 years, right? So you want to be smart about that.
Like if you come to me as a developer and say I want to put wind turbines on your farm, I don't know anything about that, so I don't know what to watch out for.
Yeah, I mean, I would say developers are generally forthright, but it always helps to have somebody help, doing advocacy on your behalf too. So,
Right.
I mean, you want to be smart about, whether it's solar or wind, you want to be smart about tile lines. Like if a tile line is damaged, who manages that? You want to be smart about how they put in the service roads. That can make, I've heard that has created some headaches for farmers where they can't actually do a tractor turn anymore where they used to. By and large, developers try and site along property lines and fence rows so they don't have that problem where they're blocking that the long path of a tractor.
As a normal farmer, quote unquote, a normal farmer, if they were to come to you and say, I'm looking for some renewable energy on my farm, solar versus wind, I mean, what are you looking at? I mean, that's probably a really long, complicated answer. There's not one easy way to look at that, but obviously, I think solar seems to be the popular one, probably because, like you said, you build it and for 30 years it produces power, right? Is wind a lot more intense when it comes to the maintenance and the building project, and does it take a lot more elbow grease just to build wind and keep it moving?
Most farmers I know don't. Well, if it's like a small on-site turbine, generally, yeah. I mean, it's sometimes the farmer has to crawl up there and grease a few things, or they have to track down a small shop that does that kind of maintenance. There are some groups that do that, but we haven't seen farmers in Minnesota have a lot of success with small wind. It's not to say there aren't good
Okay.
ones out there, but I mean,
So generally, when you work with wind, you're working with a developer.
Big time, yeah.
like a
You're
big
not putting up
developer.
a personal windmill,
Correct.
to handle 1 or 2 farms.
Correct. Generally, it's you're going to be in the field of a wind farm, and that's how the developer is going to work with you, and it's important to have those coffee shop conversations with your neighbors too. I mean, once a developer comes to town and a bunch of landowners have been approached, I've heard that there is a lot of pressure just from the community or from the farming community to say, like, let's just don't be a stick in the mud about this. Because developers they'll also make the threat, like, we're just going to pick up our ball and go down the road.
They'll find somebody.
Yeah, and it's not quite that easy. I mean, they're looking at that area because that area has transmission capacity. It takes big, thick power lines to host 100, 200 megawatt wind turbines. So they're paying close attention to the engineering of it. But I do think it helps to have an attorney look at the contract and what you've been offered and advocate for things like, okay, is there a payment for a laydown? Like, you're going to lose acreage or you're going to lose farmable land for at least a season if they have to lay down these giant turbine blades. Are you getting paid for the loss of that service road? Is it, is that creating some kind of headache? Are there good neighbor payments for people that are around? So, yeah.
No, really good info is like just considering how else can I be profitable on my farm and look at sustainability at a really holistic system.
Yeah. What are some other options besides having 9 chickens?
9 chickens, a billy goat, and
billy goat.
yeah, and a llama.
Okay.
Weigh your options. You can do either one.
Or
you
a
can do that
llama,
or put in
solar
a
panel.
solar panel.
Yeah. All right,
Or
Fritz Ebinger, thank you very much for joining us here today. Another
been
good
awesome.
conversation.
Yeah, we appreciate having you on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And now it's time on the podcast to check out what's going on in our voicemail.
Hi, my name's Colin Chant. I live in Alberta. I really like listening to you guys' podcast. I'm just wondering, what do you guys think on someone wanting to become a first-time farmer? Thank you.
Hey, Colin, thanks a lot for calling into the Fieldwork Podcast. Really appreciate it. And thanks for listening from Canada, too. Overall, my first response on farmers or, beginning farmers or people interested in getting involved in ag is like, that is fantastic. We need to have a lot more people getting involved in agriculture, especially younger people. And I think more diverse people as well, like from different backgrounds and just to bring new perspective in. But know that getting into like large scale production ag, maybe in the way that you're overall envisioning, like that's going to be really, really tough. There's a lot of startup cost in equipment, in land. There's a lot of liability to cover. So if you're going to go about it that route, I would definitely suggest finding a mentor, finding a farmer who is maybe looking at retiring relatively soon, somebody who's wanting to invest in a beginning farmer, somebody that they can, kind of mentor and help get started. So that would be the route that I would look at, if you're going to get into large scale row crop type farming. For a potentially lower capital way to get started would be to look at a different specialty market, specialty crops, smaller scale like vegetable production, something like that. Just be able to get going with a little bit less land to get going, potentially less equipment. However, some of those operations can definitely get pretty expensive too, can definitely come with a lot of startup cost. And you want to make sure that you have a market from the beginning. That is the crucial thing. You can grow all kinds of different stuff, but you have to have somewhere to sell it, or else it does you no good. Other thing to definitely look at is beginning farmer programs. I have no idea what options are available for Canada, but for the U.S., we have a really great program for beginning farmers. You can get beginning farmer loans through FSA, Farm Service Agency. That's what I was able to do when I was coming back to the family farm. I had the opportunity to buy 40 acres and was able to get a beginning farmer loan to provide low interest financing for that piece of farm ground. So basically just a easier line of credit to be able to attain. I did have to show, that I had some ag experience and that I've got, but my degree counted towards that. My internships counted towards that. Some of my experience on the farm counted towards that. So you might have to build up some of that from within the ag industry for some of those type of programs, but there's multiple options available. Keep us in the loop, and good luck.
That's it for our show today.
You can find us, as always, all over the place on social media at Fieldwork Talk, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
And of course, you have learned a lot of useful things from this podcast, so share it with all of your friends. Subscribe to Fieldwork wherever you get your podcast. Leave us some high-dollar reviews.
Oh, yeah. Tell people that we are the greatest podcast people ever.
They will figure that out for
Clearly,
themselves, but make sure you make that clear to them ahead of time.
Well, we're not the only ones that make it possible and make it sound so awesome. Thanks to the people who make the show possible. Andy Baxter, Amy Scotches-Cole, Claire Jones, Noah Boston, Christian Schmidt, Eric Romani, and Lauren Humpert.
And our live in-studio band music is written and performed by Johnny Vince Evans with help from Corey Schreppel.
Our website is fieldworktalk.org. Connect with us all over social media, and hit us up on the website.
Yeah, until next time, don't soil yourself. You okay? Are you okay?
I got a piece of that
Piece of water?
water's got rocks in it up here.
What's good for the gizzard?
It is going straight to my gizzard.